Welcome to another episode of Reason for Truth. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo. Today we want to talk about the power of the wise man or the wise woman. We want to talk about just power grabs. We want to talk about wisdom. Wisdom of just one person can, outwit an entire, nation or military. Amazing. The Bible talks about this. Gives us a lesson, that wisdom is greater than might. That's the point. We're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes. That's our truth text today, by the most wise man in the world ever to live, King Solomon. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 14 to 18. We're going to talk about wisdom is more powerful than human strength. Why? Because it comes from God. God's wisdom is so powerful that, even quiet words of a wise man are more effective than the ranting of a foolish king who tries to ram through his foolish will and agenda by sheer force. Sound familiar? This is from an ancient proverb. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. That's Proverbs 9:10. Hope you take that to heart. Welcome to Reason for Truth, where the truth comes first and the reasons come last, but where we're always and constantly learning. Because when we stop learning, we stop teaching. Really stop teaching well. Today's truth is that wisdom is more powerful than human might. And a servant's heart is stronger than a king's. A dictator's desire to just amass authority and sometimes abuse people for his own liking. Today is part one of a two-part series. We'll do the part two next week. We're going to dig more deeply into the scriptures and the 5 points that I'm going to provide for you today. I'm going to give you an overview. Next week, we'll go more deeply. Call that a little bit of a different title, but you want to make sure hit that left Sicilian hook. Boom! Knock that thing out. Make sure you subscribe. That's what I'm talking about. And then there's a little bell down there. Maybe you hit the little bell. Little Italian guy come up to you, bring you a nice piece of pizza or something. I can't guarantee that, but if you hit that knockout bell, it's going to say, listen, Garofalo, Reason for Truth, don't knock it, new episodes coming. All right, make sure you subscribe. Enough of that. I'm going to show you here that wisdom comes from God, and when we as God's servant leaders become emboldened with the wisdom of God, I didn't say the might of God, I said the wisdom of God through his word and through his power of the Holy Spirit, we can win impossible battles, becoming victorious in the midst of a very fallen world, the very fallen world that you and I live in. On September 26, 1983, going back a little bit, when I was in high school, I think, Russian Lieutenant Colonel of Soviet Air Defense Forces Slavansky Petrov saved the world, is what they say, from a nuclear war. No, he did. Sounds a little biblical, but there's a Bible story, I believe, that kind of parallels the story of Petrov. We'll find that again in our proof text in Ecclesiastes, where it says, whereby a poor wise man who had delivered a small, poorly defended city from a siege by a powerful king. Sounds like Petrov a little bit. He wasn't a famous guy, wasn't a powerful and wealthy guy, from my understanding. Just a military guy. 1983, what happened is the Soviet Union's missile attack early warning systems, all countries have these now, just about, their missile attack from early warning systems, the computer screen popped up and it falsely displayed in large red letters the words launch, speaking of nuclear warheads. It was basically telling or commanding Lieutenant Colonel Petrov, the highest ranking officer on duty at that moment, that was overseeing the early warning system. No one wants to get hit first, right? So you send some defensive and then some offensive nuclear weapons. That's not good. And this warning system came up and said with a high reliability that an American intercontinental ballistic missile called those ICBMs had been launched from the United States and was headed straight for the Soviet Union. It first showed one missile, two missiles, and eventually a total of 5 Minuteman ICBMs as having been launched. And those things go fast, like thousands of miles per hour, not hundreds. But it had been launched against Russia by the United States is what this particular radar or early warning system had showed. But see, Petrov had made a decision. He had to make a decision as to would he report the incoming American strike or take action otherwise. If he was to do so and report an incoming missile warning, Soviet nuclear doctrine mandated. It called for a full nuclear retaliation. So in other words, you send over 5, we send 5 back. No, we're going to unleash our arsenal against you. It's all out. That was their doctrine. Not a good doctrine. And there'd be no time to double-check the warning system, much less seek negotiations with the United States. But thank God Petrov did not report the incoming strike, as he and others on his staff kind of concluded that what they were seeing on the screen was a false alarm. By God's grace, as it turned out, it really was a false alarm. The system mistook the sun's reflection off the clouds for a missile attack. Amazing. Petrov prevented a nuclear war between the Soviets, who had 35,804 nuclear warheads in 1983, and the U.S., who had 23,305 nuclear missiles. Now, 1979 report by Congress Office Congressional Study estimated that the full scale of a Soviet assault on the U.S. would have killed between 35 and 77% of the United States population, the entire population, or between 82 million and 180 million citizens at that time. The inevitable U.S. counterstrike, in turn, would have killed between 20 to 40% of the Soviets' population. They're probably more sparsely spread out, or between 54 million and 108 million people. The combined death toll would have been between 136 million and 288 million people dead from such a thing. Scary. The wisdom of Colonel Petrov almost single-handedly prevented these deaths. I'm reminded of a biblical story, as we spoke on the opening here of Ecclesiastes, where, listen, a poor wise man who had delivered a small, poorly defended city from a siege by a powerful king. And after the Cold War between Russia and the United States, Petrov, by the way, went on to receive a number of commendations for saving countless lives, as well as really two nations from obliterating each other, and he was honored at the United Nations. Okay, he received a Dresden, I believe that's Dresden, Germany. My wife's family is originally from there. They received a Dresden Peace Prize, and it was profiled in a documentary, Petrov was, entitled The Man Who Saved the World. Listen, the problem with such events as this is that humans have short memories when it comes to learning lessons from history. Now, this is made evident really in modern politics, going back to the biblical story all the ways in Ecclesiastes. The people, the citizens of that city, as same as today, listen, we forget, and they forgot the poor wise man who defended that city back in this Ecclesiastes passage from a siege by a powerful king. They quickly forgot. At least in the case of Petrov, he was recognized, enough attention was gathered and given to him so that future generations might learn from this. And certainly the Soviets would learn from this. Thank God they did. And the United States to some degree. I believe that God worked through this man, Mr. Petrov, Colonel Petrov, giving him the wisdom through what appears to be, in my opinion, God's providential. Listen, it wasn't our time yet. It was God's providence, his protection, and really some kind of perhaps faith in God that we don't know he had. I looked, couldn't find any, but I don't expect the media to report as such. I don't know. Listen, we just don't know. I found no evidence in the media about Mr. Petrov's faith in God. Let me just be clear of that, but I have to wonder if he had some. That would be interesting. If anybody wants to know something about that, send it on in to me. I'll respond to it. It'd be great to do a follow-up on this podcast, on this episode. But perhaps I simply don't know. One thing is clear is that God used this non-famous but wise man to prevent a massive war and spared hundreds of thousands of deaths. Listen, I believe that in this case that God used an unknown but wise man to thwart the use of massive force by two of the most lethal nuclear-equipped militaries in the world. In the Bible, going back over 3,000 years to 935 BC, famous King Solomon wrote this. He said this, "There was once a small city with only a few people in it, and a powerful king came against it, surrounded it, and built a huge siege works against it. Now there lived in that city a man poor but wise, and he saved the city by his wisdom, but nobody remembered that poor man." So I said, wisdom is better than strength. Wise words from King Solomon, but the poor man's wisdom is despised. It goes on to say that, and his words are no longer heeded. Wow. Short memories. Remember what I said? It's Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verses 14 to 18. Again, this was written circa 935. Going back almost 3,000 years. You could see people don't change in that sense. Listen, man is not evolving. We're the same then as human beings as we are today. Written by King Solomon again, the most wisest man ever to live. And he provides us this story. I think God provides us this story through King Solomon about really how a massive and powerful military or whatever group of people operation came against a small, non-defendable city. And what happened? This victory was denied this massive powerhouse, this massive military force of this nation which prevented them from invading the small city by wisdom of one simple, poor but wise man. This leads us to ask, listen, how did this poor but wise man defeat this powerful and mighty military? The conclusion is wisdom. That's God's wisdom, by the way. God's word is clear that wisdom is preferable, more powerful and more preferable than human strength and military might. Looking back a few verses to going back, below this, because we started at 14. Let's look at 11 to 12. Solomon makes clear that life is really unpredictable, which is why human ability and human wisdom, there's no guarantee of success under the sun. Verse 11. My son and I love watching battle bots. It's robot fighting time. Anybody watch? That's pretty cool. These teams put together these robots and they fight in this ring, kind of like a boxing match. It never seems to amaze me. You'll see these matches and they put together their robots. I can't count how many times that, the perceived winner loses because their weapon mechanism breaks, their battery catches on fire, they get a good hit. Really, in that game, I tell you, there's people that you think are going to be like completely washouts, and all of a sudden they beat one of the top robots. It's amazing. Remember, their battery catches on fire, but a lot of times their opponent outdrives them with superior wisdom. Aha! What makes BattleBots so riveting for my son and I? Listen, it's unpredictable. Similarly, in the Bible, King Solomon makes clear in the same chapter of Ecclesiastes that the time of one's death is also unpredictable in verse 12. Same is true for those battle bots. Listen, it's important because it ties into God's providence and God's wisdom, and that we don't know God's plan, but godly wisdom is the key to victory. Verse 12 says, man does not know his time of death. Death and disaster can overtake man as suddenly as fish or birds are captured. Verse 12, in the case of this small, itty-bitty little city, whatever wisdom this poor man had made clear in that God's providence, that even the largest military knows not the time of their demise or their defeat, or that their military superiority is going to win. What sustains one victory is according to God's will and consistent trust in God. Not forgetting to, act according to God's wisdom can end in your own demise. I'm not saying every time, because God's will may be for the opponent to win. But God's wisdom in general, this is wisdom literature, is that generally speaking, this is true. This is a truth. This leads us to verses 13 to 18. We said 14 to 18. I'll stretch it back to 13 to 18, which is our truth text for today. And as we read the opening story regarding the theme of God's wisdom lived out in the life of humans on earth emerges. First, this story, by the way, is about God's wisdom through his inspired word as an example of wisdom, not being rewarded, right? Verse 11 is a poor wise man who had delivered a small, poorly defended city from a siege by a powerful king, but the poor man's wisdom went unrewarded, which we're going to talk about. Why? Because nobody remembered him. Okay, that's a problem. We as Americans, and I think many other nations, have very short memories. A friend of mine grew up in a Muslim country, West Africa, Burkina Faso, and he says they'll go back a lot of times and remember 7 or 8 generations back, their grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-great, and so on. It's amazing how, past our grandparents, most of the time in the Western world, we don't know that. I'm doing a genealogical tree now. It's pretty fascinating. We're giving up a lot by not knowing that. I tip my hat to Burkina Faso and that culture for doing that. Listen, we could also see in 1 Samuel 25:31, it says really remember, the word remember there in 1 Samuel 25:31 conveys the idea of reward. See, Solomon said this example is greatly impressed on him. That's what he said. That was significant to him. Literally, it was great to me is what he said in light of his previous discussion, to give really context, Ecclesiastes 11 to 12. And it's through wisdom, really, that is proven better than strength is the point. And then a case whereby military might again was defeated by a poor wise man. And then we're going to talk about that today. In the end, listen, the man, to summarize, he ended up receiving no benefits for his wisdom, no big paycheck, didn't even get remembered. His wisdom was not only not remembered, it was despised. How often do we see that? Someone saves the day and they're like, get out of here, we're done with you, right? And had his words not been heeded, they'd be taken over and they'd all be probably either put to death or put into slavery. And what happened? He remained poor and he remained unremembered, but not in God's eyes. Now, here speaking to wealth and social esteem, Ecclesiastes 9, again, 11 says, against all odds, a poor man somehow delivered the city. And the man wasn't rich. And so, whose people did what? They probably and conveniently forgot him once they were delivered. Verse 15. This is a major problem in today's society, as it was in the time of Solomon. See, in the 21st century, the body of Christ has been going through one trial after another. The problem is that once we are delivered by God from a trial, a time of suffering, we return to our old ways. Everyone says, I want to get back to the new normal, and forget who bailed us out of this thing in the first place. This is a product of our depending on our own human wisdom over that of God's all-powerful and perfect wisdom. This episode highlights both really the power and the limits of wisdom. Verse 16 gives a limit of wisdom. How could wisdom be limited, I asked, and I want to leave you with some basic takeaways before we cover that. See, I'm baiting you for the next episode, which is going to be next week. We're going to cover something different on Thursday, but I'll develop that more in our next episode. But for this episode, I want to leave you with about 5 different takeaways. And this is what I want you to do. I want you to write these down and work through them before I speak any more on them, because I want you to participate in learning, and learning is by doing. Remember, if we're not learning, we're not teaching. We're not at least not teaching well. So I want you, to learn. Therefore, you can teach your Sunday school this information and teach others, your children and your neighbors and coworkers and those in your church or just your circles. Okay. I want to read this passage. We've already read it. Listen, again, write it down. Put your thoughts to each one. I'll give you just a brief overview of it, in the sense that wisdom is so powerful that even the quiet words of a wise man are more effective than the ranting of a foolish king who tried to ram through his foolish will by sheer force. Remember verse 17 to give context. All right, takeaway 1 is this. Wisdom is so powerful that even the quiet words of a wise man are more effective than the ranting of a foolish king who tried to ram through his foolish will by sheer force. It's verse 17. I think we've covered that a lot. But listen, at the end of the day, when we see people ranting and going crazy, and we see a calm person that is exhibiting wisdom, that's the way we want to be. You're not only going to impress upon the other person, but you're going to impress upon all that are listening. So we want to make sure that we act wisely and not foolish. Okay, that's takeaway number 1. Takeaway number 2 is that wisdom is better than weapons of war. Verse 18, that's why we have diplomacy. And when we talk about having diplomats and people that go to speak to other countries, we're diplomatic about it, right? Well, we want to be that way within the church and within the body, and certainly with our neighbors, however different they may be. Whatever country or preference or whatever they might be, let's be more diplomatic than contentious, okay? Takeaway number 2, let's make sure that we act with wisdom versus contentions, okay? Takeaway number 3 is that despite the power of wisdom in the hands of sinful man, wisdom is still not invulnerable, as we've talked about. It says one sinner can ruin much good wrought by wisdom by simply forgetting God and ignoring God's wisdom as he or she or they as a nation relish their temporal victories and comfort. I pray that, listen, we're not going to do this. Perhaps you could add this to your prayer list, Make sure that we understand that when something happens, we're going to talk again more deeply about this next week, the different trials certainly the United States has faced, and my friend Roscoe in South Africa can attest to the same. I think he's old enough to remember or know from his parents the changes that country's been through. There's a lot of changes all nations go through, good and bad, and we want to make sure we learn from them. And we have to make sure that we understand that lest we forget the wisdom, we're going to repeat our mistakes, okay? So what I want you to do is take these things, add them into your prayer list this week. Give some examples of your own life. Put them into your quiet time. Perhaps add these questions, these points into your devotions. And then leave really constructive comments below, especially about, listen, was Petrov a believer? I'd love to know that if anybody knows that, but I promise to respond. Very reasonable amount of time. All comments, listen, are welcome. And we review them. We ask that you respond really in the spirit of Christ. This is a Christian channel, at least a spirit of love, God's love, so I'll take that. and respect, not hostility. We get some of that, and listen, we'll dialogue very briefly with you, and then there's just nothing really constructive. We're here to reason, not argue with anybody. So I hope that makes sense for you. Leave those comments. If you want more in-depth training, you can check out our brand new online training academy called equippedacademy.com. That's dipping into the deep end a little bit there. And make sure you check our website out at reasonfortruth.bible, reasonfortruth.org. We've got everything on there. I think you'll find a lot of resources. If you're listening on podcast or by way of video, listen, please go ahead, man, smash that subscribe button with that little bell there. Boom! Go ahead, smash that subscription button. Smack that little alert bell down there. You'll be good. Little, as I promised, I can't say that little Sicilian guys and girls are come out and bring you a pizza. That I can't guarantee you. But if you want, you go down to the corner, guarantee somewhere around your house, there's a great Italian restaurant that makes the pizza. Subscribe. Listen, alert bell. Get some pizza. Make sure you tune in for the next episode whereby I'm going to expound really much more deeply, quite a bit more deeply. You don't want to miss that because I only gave you a top view today about God's wisdom in your life as being mightier and more powerful than human strength and human wisdom. Until next time, I'll see you for the next episode of Reason for Truth. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo, and this is your Reason for Truth for today.